Well, my day seems to have passed by with trying to chase up some phishing attempts on my computer, and a massive little virus I think got on there from somebody trying to gain access to my accounts, and I actually fell for this one slightly. Normally I'm very good on them, but this was so well produced that before I realised I'd clicked. Anyway, I think I sorted all that out, or I hope I have. And now for the rest of the evening I've just come down here with the watercolour stuff to see if I can do a quick watercolour, because I did a pastel last and just thought it would be nice to do a watercolour again. Just look how lovely it is down here. Beautiful spots to paint, aren't they? In fact, that's quite nice, just that as it is. Beautiful places, these. Autumn colours just showing, not quite there yet. And a lot more water now. That's a lovely scene as well, isn't it? It's been one of my favourite views, with the reflections from the tree on the left here coming down. Lovely spot. Up through these leaf-strewn steps of roots. I think this is where I'll do the picture. Big old trees here, marking the old mill. Many artists have stopped. It's a bit unpredictable, so I'd better be getting on pretty quickly. I've just brought down a little easel stool, my watercolours, and a stretch piece of knots up here quite nicely and do that scene. Lovely light for oils actually tonight. Let's see what we can do. And there's the composition I've sketched out. So let's see what I can do. So a nice oval mop to start with. And I haven't even wet the paint yet, but it's funny old weather, it's very grey. You can see them just down beside me here. There we go, look, little set down there. All I'm going to need. There we go. I'll start with the lights and finish with the darks. And the light is there, the others are going to be here, so the water's just trickling down and around. But let's start with a lovely washing of yellows and turquoises to try and get the background effect of these. Now I will run the film straight through at speed. So we're going to start off painting wet into wet. A little water on the paper first, then I'll start with lemon yellow and drop this into the water, adding various quantities of it to make it lighter or darker. Then I'll move to some chrome yellow to make it slightly warmer, darker yellow, and then add some blue, some turquoise, some cerulean will do this in with the yellow to make a green, to make a cool green, because I want a turquoise green at the moment. You see, now I'm adding a stronger blue and a stronger yellow. Then I'm going to add some yellow ochre to my cobalt blue to make a much warmer blue, a much warmer green. I want to keep this light misty effect for the background, so I'm going to keep adding wet into wet at the moment, and as it dries it will gradually become sharper edged. We paint wet into wet or wet next to wet, we get soft edges. We paint wet on dry, we get hard edges. So at the moment you can see I'm just playing with the very thin light coats of paint, which we call a wash, and then I'm going to drop heavier colour into that, gradually making it stronger and stronger with more pigment. So at first it's very thin paint, then I'm gradually adding thicker pigment into it, and I'm going for my cools towards my warms generally. Okay, so we've said the preliminary coat is called a wash, and the wash can be graduated or variegated. Graduated means it changes from lighter to darker or darker to lighter, and variegated means it changes colour. When the wash is dry, because watercolour is transparent, we can paint a thin layer over it, and that's called a glaze. Normally with watercolour we don't use white, we'll leave the white paper, or we'll put masking fluid, which is a rubber fluid, on first, let that dry, and then when you rub it off later you get the white paper underneath. In this case I'm going to leave some white, but I am going to use another technique where we use a little bit of white gouache, white acrylic will do, and paint some of the lights back in at the very end, just add some sparkle back in because I'm not using masking fluid. You'll see here that I'm working not only from light to dark as we do with watercolour, we work from light to dark, leaving our lights behind with watercolour. With an opaque paint such as acrylic, we can paint the lights over the top. With this We can't, unless we put the white gouache at the end. Not only am I working from light to dark, working from cool to warm, so the background colours are always cooler than the foreground unless it's a sunrise or sunset. So you'll see my cool blues and cool greens and light colours in the background here, and then coming towards stronger colours as I go over the top, and warmer colours at the front. So my yellows and oranges and so on are much warmer, more orange at the front, and the blues and greens and yellows are much cooler in the background. Gradually now you see me working up the warmer colours of the water, reflections and gravel. It's a bit like baking a cake. You want a good recipe. So we normally have the detail in the front as well. We have more texture in the foreground, and it goes softer and more vague as the atmosphere creates more water droplets in the air into the background. Of course you can change pictures as you want. It's your painting. If you want to concentrate on one area and have a focal point and make that more detailed and have it like a vignette with the surrounding being softer, you can do that. But in this case I'm going to go a little more detailed in the foreground. I'm not going to go very detailed at all because I want this effect of light. I just want an effect of watercolour, the luminosity, the transparency of it, the fluidity of it. I'm certainly not painting a very figurative, photographic watercolour. That's not what my painting is about. My painting is about the medium, the material, the ambience, the light, the moment, the time, and to capture that, not to make a copy of a photograph or not to make a photographic representation. The camera can do that better than I can. Now you see the background underpainting is dry, and I'm starting to paint on top some harder edges. I'm painting wet on dry, which gives me a hard edge. Those small branches, for instance, now are sharp edged, although I'm still controlling it. Watercolour is what we call controlled accident. We want to use the accidents of the paint, know what's going to happen, and control those as they spread. It's the beauty we have with such a medium. We can use the accident for our own purposes and not rub it all out. You'll also see that in some places I took out some watercolour. I used the brush just damp to lift out areas of watercolour to make them lighter. You can take watercolour out that way as well as put watercolour over the top to make it darker. I only use 3 brushes in this. I'm using a Pro Art large oval mop for nearly all of my work, as Ron Ranson used to use a hake. Then I'm using a rigger at the end, as Ron Ranson did, to put in the finer branches. And finally, when I put the bit of gouache, the white gouache back, I use a small round. The thing with glazes is, if we put the same thickness of a glaze over the previous glaze, it will go one glaze darker. In other words, it's like putting pieces of coloured transparent glass over each other. Now, the thicker I make that glaze over the top, the thicker I paint over the top, the darker it'll be. So I have 2 ways to do this. I can keep putting glazes on, or I can put slightly heavier paint with more pigment in over the top. So what I'm doing now is I'm starting to paint in some much heavier, darker paint, a much thicker mix, to make some of these darks and bring out the shadows more. But I still want to keep that luminosity. I don't want it to be overworked. Watercolours easily become overworked. I want to keep them nice and fresh with only a few layers of paint. Now you see me lifting out paint in the cascade or waterfall area. Normally I'd leave whiter areas here or put masking fluid on so that we get bright, sharp sparkles there. In this case I just wanted a very wet into wet, luminous effect, so I've left some white, now I've got to lift some out. At the very end I'll pick up some white gouache and we'll start to put in little white dots back where I would have left the white paper. It will hardly show as not being white paper. I also want to bring out the surface of the water more. You can see I've already put in some of the ripples and the reflections, but I want to show the little bits of froth and foam that are sparkling down the surface as well, so I'll use little bits of white gouache there as well. Now if I wanted more texture for the leaves and fine grasses and things, this is where I would start to use a sponge or even some of that moss we used earlier on in the acrylic. But I don't want that much texture. I'm just use a little bit of brushwork for some of the leaves, just show the difference between the warm branches and the cooler branches, and just to graduate the edges a bit. My advice in painting still water reflections in almost any medium is to paint the verticals first and then bring the horizontals over the top and the surface afterwards. Paint the depth of water, paint the reflections first, and then look at the surface afterwards. Then back again to my final darks as I bring out the darks at the edges of the water that's reflecting and the tree roots and branches and pebbles, where there's going to be quite sharp edges to get that feeling of reflection against actual stones and pebbles. Now I'm using brush marks to actually indicate the larger leaves coming towards the foreground, so the background becomes soft and misty and the foreground a little sharper. So here we are adding the white gouache. Don't overdo it, otherwise it'll look silly. Just a bit of sparkle here and there, a few lights here and there and highlights, especially where that little waterfall comes over. Bit of fun then, nice little lively, delicate and luminous watercolour, I hope. So we've worked through various ways of using acrylics with our hands, with moss, with brushes, with rollers. We went into the pastel and did the pastel traditional. What I might do next is a water and pastel, which is in between what I've shown you and this. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this film. It's quite simply made. As you see, I don't have to carry much materials with me. I have my little easel chair in this case, a bag to carry my paints in, water jar. I've got water ready beside me here on the river and fill up easily. A little box of Sonnet Russian watercolour paints, which I quite like because they're quite strong. And then I've stretched a piece of watercolour paper over. It was a £140 knot in this case. So there we are, a little loose watercolour of the Petite Creuse, only a few hundred yards up from the confluence where it joins the Grande Creuse, and where Monet himself walked down this path and would have viewed this area years ago. It's wonderful to think that I'm painting in the valley of the Impressionists and following their footsteps. Well, bye for now. I've just been painting with acrylics for you, both with the brush and with my fingers and with natural materials. I've just been painting the pastels, and now I've done a watercolour, and I think my next painting for you is going to be a pastel and water, where I do a landscape using both water and pastel to mix.